Good evening. My name is Tremaine Austin Dillon, and I'm the Programs and Policy Specialist in the Office of the President at Sonoma State University. On behalf of my collaborators, George Gropentine and Shelly Gomez from the Hub Cultural Center, we welcome you to this virtual roundtable discussion titled Gender, Race, and the History of Voting in America. Today is the 8th day of Latinx Heritage Month, and I wanted to send a special thank you to the Planning Committee for including this panel as part of the celebrations. Before we dive into our conversation today, I'm going to share some technical information. Attendees, you should know that your microphone is muted. We encourage any questions that you may have for our panelists be typed into the chat button in Zoom. We will monitor the chat and address questions at the end of the panel. This webinar will be recorded and shared with the SSU community for viewing at a later date. Equality and political participation in the United States requires that all citizens, regardless of their social status or demographic characteristics, be allowed to participate in the system, regardless of income or education. Unfortunately, the invention of race, massive wealth disparities, and whiteness has systemically stunted the growth of many people of color and other marginalized identities. Systemic racism and systemic oppression, which exists at the institutional level through harmful policies and practices, and across structures, including education, health, transportation, and economy, are interconnected and reinforced over time. We see the attempt of dismantling these systems with organizations like the Black Lives Matter movement, which is acting to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence that is inflicted in Black communities by the state and vigilantes. We also see organizations like Fair Fight, which was started by voting rights activist Stacey Abrams, who encourages voter participation in elections, brings awareness to the public on election reform, and engages in other voter education programs and communications to combat voter suppression nationally. Today, we are going to address some important questions. How do we help solve voter suppression? How have race and gender impacted voting rights in America? And my favorite question that I'm hoping that we can get answered, does every vote actually matter? Today, we have some great people that are with us who are going to help lead our conversation. 5 panelists from Sonoma State University: Sarah Clegg, the Senior Director in the Office for the Prevention of Harassment and Discrimination; Steve Estes, Professor and Chair of the Department of History; Gerald Jones, Interim AVP for Student Access and Educational Equity; Lauren Morimoto, Professor in the Department of Kinesiology; and Kim Hester-Williams, Professor of Literature and Interim Chair of American Multicultural Studies. Thank you all for being here today. Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away just a few days ago on September 18th. Her passing has sparked grief, but also I've seen a lot of celebrations and joy and people just being really happy that she was alive and existed and did some great work for our country. Sarah Clegg, how does the passing of RBG affect our upcoming election?
Thanks, Tremaine, and thank you to all of you for including me in this panel. I'm going to speak a little bit about Justice Ginsburg's passing and how it might impact our upcoming election. But first, I want to just acknowledge and send my own condolences to her family and to all those that loved her. She, outside of any partisanship or politics, she was widely realized as a trailblazer and a hero to many, and it's very clear that her accomplishments, her words, her actions are already a part of our American history. So I'm going to do my best to answer this question in a very fact-based way, but I want to acknowledge my own biases. As a private citizen, I do have my own political opinions. To the extent that I can, I'm going to focus my answer on the impact of her passing on civil rights, which is the area in which I work at SSU. So I'm tying it in that way. So a couple of factors that that link Justice Ginsburg's passing with the 2020 election. First of all, it's the proximity. We're 41 days away from the election. As Tremaine said, Justice Ginsburg passed a few days ago, and I think unless you have not been watching the news or social media, it's tough to not realize what that has meant and the uproar that has caused. It was a common practice in the past that any major policy action or court appointment would be delayed at this point in time out of respect for the upcoming election and pending results. Only 2 other justices have ever passed closer to a national election, one in the 1950s and one last century. So the proximity is a big deal. The next is precedent. And with regards to precedent, all I can say is Merrick Garland, who is the judicial elephant in the room with regards to the nomination to replace Justice Ginsburg. Very, very briefly, I'll just say that, just kind of recap, in 2016, Justice Antonin Scalia passed, and then President Barack Obama nominated Judge Merrick Garland to be his replacement. The Republican-led Senate, led by Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, decided not to hold any hearings to even consider the nomination until the election was over. And that was some 200 days before the election. So again, going back to that proximity, we're much closer than we were in 2016. What transpired afterwards was a very contentious nomination and installation of Justice Neil Gorsuch. Later on in President Trump's term, there was another equally, if not more contentious appointment to the Supreme Court of Justice Brett Kavanaugh. So at this point in time, the big question was, if another Supreme Court justice did pass, would the precedent be set that was set in 2016, would that be upheld? And the answer, as we've seen in the recent days, is no. The Senate plans to hold hearings on President Trump's nomination, and it possibly even confirm that justice prior to the election. It seems very clear that they have the votes to do that, and at this point, it's debatable if there's much that can be done. So let me talk about what's at stake, and Tremaine, feel free to chime in when I'm going over time, but I do have some notes on what's at stake with this appointment. In terms of civil rights, as I said, there are several big issues that are coming into play in terms of court cases that could be overturned with a majority conservative court, or new cases that could be heard that could provide, that could prove to be problematic in terms of civil rights. The first is Roe v. Wade. This is the highest profile court decision that may be overturned at this point if a conservative justice is installed as Justice Ginsburg's replacement. It's a 1973 landmark decision that ruled that a pregnant woman has the liberty to choose to have an abortion without excessive government restriction. So interesting fact here is that Justice Ginsburg was not a fan of, not a huge fan of Roe v. Wade, but not for the reasons you might think. She actually saw it being focused on the wrong area, which is on a woman's privacy to her own medical decisions. And she felt that it really should be a decision based in gender equity. And that is what she is widely known as being a strong advocate for, as you can see with the quote on the screen, is being an advocate for gender equity. And it has long been a desire of a coalition of conservatives to overturn that court case. There is a genuine risk that might happen. No one really can game out exactly what that risk might be, but it does exist. The second is healthcare. So as if 2020 hasn't caused us enough anxiety, the Supreme Court is going to hear a challenge to the Affordable Care Act 1 week after the presidential election. Depending on that decision, there's multiple things that could happen, up to and including completely overturning the entire Affordable Care Act, which would leave millions without health care, upend our healthcare system, and put a lot of healthcare providers into a state of chaos. So again, having a majority conservative court could have an impact on whether or not the Affordable Care Act is upheld or not. Next, we move on, and forgive me for moving so quickly. Speaking so quickly, there's just a lot to cover here. The next, we move on to LGBTQ plus rights. And so the federal rights that the LGBTQ community have gained over the past few decades, a lot of that is based in some pretty landmark Supreme Court decisions. The United States versus Windsor, which ruled that the Defense of Marriage Act was unconstitutional. Obergefell versus Hodges, which basically legalized same-sex marriage, and most recently Bostock versus Clayton County, which gave transgender Americans the civil right that others receive, which is protection from being fired from their employment on the basis of their gender identity. Not to sound like a broken record, but whoever fills Justice Ginsburg's seat could play a role in whether or not these rights that have been afforded to the LGBTQ community remain in place. Next is DACA and immigration. So in June of 2020, the Supreme Court gave a temporary reprieve to the Dreamers. They were not, what happened was the Trump administration decided to end DACA via executive order. That decision went to court, and the Supreme Court ruled that while the president had the right to do what he didn't do it properly. He didn't follow process correctly, and therefore overturned the executive order. To the best of my knowledge, there are plans, if President Trump wins re-election, there's plans to bring that executive order back, and do it via the process that was outlined by the Supreme Court. So once again, that really could be significantly impacted by the number of conservative justices on the court versus liberal. Last is election integrity. It's not certain, but even today, President Trump has stated that he must install the 9th justice to the court because he expects a legal challenge to the outcome of the election. So both sides politically have concerns that might lead to legal challenges to the election outcome. So once again, that balance of the ideologies of the justices it matters. It really does matter. A couple of things to consider. The SCOTUS appointments, Supreme Court appointments, have often been seen as a marquee issue for Republicans and conservatives, something that's very important to them. Polling has borne that out for years and years. Democrats have not shown the same interest in Supreme Court appointments in terms of presidential topics or reasons to vote for the candidate of their choice. But that changed with Brett Kavanaugh's appointment. It came right in the conflagration of the Me Too movement, the Women's March, and all of the chaos that followed his nomination. It brought Supreme Court nominations and Supreme Court justices to the forefront of a lot of Democratic and progressive voters who now, polling is showing us, are starting to see it more as a critical issue. So what that means is turnout. Turnout is expected to be, or turnout or interest is expected to grow on the Republican side because of the Supreme Court pick. But this year, as opposed to years past, it's definitely growing on the Democratic side as well. In just 48 hours after Justice Ginsburg passed, Democratic organizations and campaigns raised over $100 million, which kind of blew fundraising records out of the water. So we'll see how, if there is any kind of anecdotal connection between the admiration for Justice Ginsburg and her passing to voter turnout. And lastly, let me just make sure I have enough time here. Lastly, there is the Democrats' response to the installation of a new justice at this point in time. Again, nothing has been determined, nothing's been decided, but there has been now, which we are not accustomed to hear, more talk about responding to that action with things like statehood for the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and other U.S. territories, which would increase the number of senators and hopefully, and ideally increase the number of Democratic senators, which is why they're talking about doing it. Additionally, there are things like the killing of the filibuster that you may hear bantered about by political pundits, which would make it easier to install nominees. And then lastly is the, probably the most important one, which is to increase the number of justices on the court. There's no hard and fast rule that there must only be the number that there currently are. There can be more justices added to the court. So what the Democratic leadership in Congress has said is that at this point, nothing is off the table, and that's a direct quote. Nothing's off the table in terms of how Democrats may respond if they end up winning the White House and the Senate and the House in November. So with that, those are my very, very quick talking points. Bottom line is Justice Ginsburg's passing is really critical and very important. It has an important effect on the election, and it will have an important effect. We just don't quite know right now what that effect will be.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
You gave a very thorough analysis. I thought of that question, and I thought that you would be the best person for that question, and I appreciate the response. I'm going to open it up to the panel if there's any thoughts that you have on this particular question. Okay, we're going to keep it moving. I appreciate that. Okay, so next we have a question that is geared towards Dr. Kim Hester-Williams. It's a landmark moment when the U.S. Constitution, includes an amendment that prohibits the government from using sex as a criteria for voting rights. And so the question is, why didn't the Black women's struggle for the vote end with the passage of the 19th Amendment? But I want to take a moment and just recognize who we have on our screen right now. Unless you've taken a break from all media, you know that Senator Kamala Harris became the first Black woman to accept the vice presidential nomination from a major political party. She also became the first Asian American woman, the first graduate of an HBCU, and the first Alpha Kappa Alpha, the nation's oldest Black sorority. And so with that context, with that frame, where we are now, Dr. Hester-Williams, what took Black women so long to get the vote?
That's an excellent question, Tremaine. Thank you for that question, and thank you, Sarah, for that excellent summary and what you presented as far as the jurisprudence and the politics and the cultural politics around the passing of RBG, which we mourn, and I also express condolences and a sense of sadness that we are not able to celebrate her fully without having all of these divisive politics interfere with a more stringent, a more sort of expressive, a more transparent, and really just sort of vigorous, vibrant celebration of her legacy. I will, similarly to Sarah, I will talk about the law a little bit. The short answer to your question, Tremaine, is anti-Blackness. That's the short answer to your question. The reason Black women were not able to exercise their electoral franchise with the passing of the 19th Amendment in 1920 was simply anti-Blackness, structural racism, cultural oppression, and just the persistence of not only racist culture, but violence against Black people. Some might remember in the 1960s when African Americans were pressing for the right to vote, the legal right to vote, the clear legal right to vote. And I have to be very specific about that because if you think about it technically, the 19th Amendment barred discrimination from voting on the basis of sex, right? So that technically all women could vote, just like technically if we think about the post-civil rights era, and if we think about the 14th Amendment, for instance, in 1868, all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former slaves, it said, had equal protection under the law. Black men at post-civil rights were technically allowed to vote, but were they, what kinds of obstacles, to your question, were in the way? Why didn't they vote? Why didn't they exercise the electoral franchise? The violence that ensued in the Reconstruction era toward African Americans, already we had a system and a culture that naturalized, that normalized violence against Black people. That took on a completely different tenor and a kind of rigor, if you will, that was unimaginable. And we know that from the periods of lynching, from the history of lynching. So I just want to point out a few laws. I usually tell my students, how did slavery happen? Legalized racialized slavery happen? One law at a time, really. And so I won't go back too far to, for instance, in the 17th century with the law instantiating the dismemberment of unruly slaves, the idea that Black people could be slaves in perpetuity, all of those laws. But I will instead take us a little bit to the mid-19th century with the passage in 1850 of the Fugitive Slave Act, really making it not only, it was obviously illegal for slaves to escape, enslaved people to escape, but then white people who were allies, who were working on the Underground Railroad and helping African Americans, people of African descent, were also then subject to legal punishment for helping slaves, assisting enslaved people in any way. In 1857, many of you probably know about the Dred Scott case, in which Judge Taney, who was the Supreme Court Justice at the time and wrote the majority opinion, said very explicitly that people of African descent, Black people, whether they were enslaved or not, enslaved or free, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, period. As my 23-year-old would say, period. So that was it, you know? And so the dehumanization of Black people was something that was not only happening, being institutionalized in the law, but it was also being, again, normalized through the culture. Seeing Black people as not fully human was institutionalized and practiced regularly. Extra-legal killing. We talk about Black Lives Matter, but if we think about the lynching, history of lynching, we know that crowds of white people gathered together. I think that the series Watchmen does a really good job, starring Regina King, of showing the cultural, all of the cultural layers of this anti-Blackness, right? And people sort of becoming sort of comfortable with the idea that Black people are not humans. So if you're comfortable with the idea that Black people are not fully human and don't have the full and complete rights that you have, that maybe they shouldn't even have them, maybe they're not even capable of exercising those rights, then you become comfortable with policing them. And we could talk about the whole, you know, idea of the bird watcher and the policing through, you know, using the state against Black people when you believe that they are out of their place. Then of course, if you believe that it's okay for them not to have rights, and then it's okay to use violence, either legal or extra legal violence, to ensure that they don't exercise rights that you don't believe that they should have for whatever reasons, then there's not too far to believe that they shouldn't have civil rights and that they shouldn't have the electoral franchise. And I'm not going to psychologize too much, but think about a person that might be saying to themselves, well, as they did in the 19th century about the suffrage movement, there were debates about women voting, and those debates would turn into conversations like, well, if women get the vote, they're just going to vote like the husband's going to vote for them. They don't have the capacity to understand voting and to understand politics. This is not their realm. And so it wouldn't be fair to give women the vote, because they wouldn't be voting as individuals. They would be just voting with their husbands or their male caretaker. Let's just suppose that you have the same opinion about Black people, and we know that people do infantilize Black people and see them as children, which was also instantiated in the law, which again, I won't go into because there are so many laws dehumanizing Black people, seeing them as less than human. We know the Constitution originally said that enslaved people were 3/5 of a person. So this is a very long and deep history. And when we get to the suffrage movement being, the culmination of it at that point in 1920, there's no question that Black women would be included, just like there was no question in the post-Civil War era with in 1868. There was no, sure, the law said technically Black men could vote, but then of course the South, what did they do? They instituted all of these Jim Crow laws and a culture that essentially required people to be on board with the idea, right? Pressured people, policed people, white people, to be on board with the idea that whether or not they have the legal right to do it doesn't mean they should do it. And I will point out one last thing, and that is Albert Bledsoe was a mathematician in the 19th century. And he wrote a book in 1856, which was really, again, around the same time as the Dred Scott case. He wrote a book called Liberty and Slavery, in which he argued book-length argument about why Black people should not be enfranchised. And he includes a lot of other people in there, including women, but he mainly is arguing that slavery is a just system, and that some people should be enslaved, and those people who are enslaved, and Black people in general, are not qualified. They are not qualified for the electoral franchise. And so not much actually changed by the time we got to 1920. And we know that it wasn't until the 1960s, of course, in 1965, 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, and then 1965 with the Voting Rights Act, that actually addressed these inequities, the structural racism that had gone on for more than a century, right? 2 centuries, 3 centuries. The structural racism had been instantiated. So that's the answer. Anti-Blackness.
Anti-Blackness. Thank you so much for that history lesson, that recap. Who were some of the Black women leaders that helped move that needle along?
In the 19th century, Frances Harper was an advocate for both women's rights and Black rights. Civil rights and women's rights sort of marched along side by side up to a point, and I won't get into that. But so you definitely had that. Sojourner Truth, who we all know. People who are less known for their civil rights activism would be definitely, if we look at Harriet Jacobs, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and the writers as a literary person. So I'm going to talk about the writers, right? So, and Frederick Douglass, by the way, who was a staunch women's rights advocate as well as a Black rights advocate. With the Underground Railroad, I mean, all the people involved in that, the Grimke sisters, there's a long list, but in the modern era, we can't forget people like Shirley Chisholm, who I see you have up there for sure, Annie Lee Cooper, you know, and you know, there are many names that we for, you know, for mothers and forefathers of this movement towards civil rights that is still continuing, including Kamala Harris. Yes.
Thank you for saying those names and acknowledging them. And thank you for everything that you just said. Hopefully people were able to hear that. I know that there's some technical sounds happening right now that we're not really sure where they're coming from, but we're working on it. We're hoping that everybody has their microphone muted and that they are engaged in the conversation. Thank you, Dr. Hester-Williams. Just for all of you out there watching and listening, we appreciate you. And if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat. We will be collecting questions and answering some questions at the end of the panel. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat at the bottom of the Zoom. All right, so we're gonna move on to California. Professor of History, Steve Estes, we appreciate you being here this evening, answering the call to come out. And I looked at your background and I noticed that you have an interest in California. And so I thought it would be appropriate to ask you something about California. What are some of the historical laws, policies, and social movements in the state of California that have impacted voting rights for underrepresented identities and communities?
Thanks, Jermaine. That's a great question. I had to turn off on my mic. Yeah, it's an honor to be on the panel, so thank you. And I'm pleased to hear all the other presentations, especially the historical ones. Kim Hester-Williams, bring the historical thunder. Amazing. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about 4 episodes in California history that I think basically suggest why the vote is so important and why people try to take it away from other people. And it starts very early. I mean, it actually starts at the very beginning of California's state history. In 1849, all white male group created and crafted the California Constitution. That Constitution limited the right to vote to only white male citizens. And so if you're not sure why that mattered, some of the first laws passed by that California legislature that was elected after the Constitutional Convention, one, right away, they take away the right of African Americans to testify in court against white people. Any case involving a white plaintiff or defendant, no African American is allowed to testify. And then another example, in 1855, 6 years after the Constitutional Convention, that same legislature, all-white legislature, passes the Greaser Act. That's the terms they used. Obviously not appropriate terms today, but that act, that law, was, for all intents and purposes, a vagrancy law against Mexican and Mexican Americans, saying that if Mexican and Mexican Americans could not, quote, give good account of themselves, in other words, explain who they worked for and why they were in a certain place, they could be arrested. No other necessary charges other than this law. So let's fast forward a little bit. California comes to the Civil War, and as probably many of you know, California sides with the Union with an asterisk, and that is that there are a lot of pro-Democrats, pro-Southerners in California, Southern expats basically who had moved out to California, some of whom had brought their slaves, as a matter of fact. And so there is antipathy towards the growth of federal power and the expansion of civil rights after the Civil War in California. I'll give you 2 examples. White Californians opposed almost to a person the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which Dr. Hester-Williams mentioned earlier. And in fact, the governor at the time, whose name was Haight, we have a street named for him in San Francisco, among other things, obviously, really wanted to defend a white man's democracy. Now, interestingly enough, Haight and the other Democrats weren't worried about African Americans voting because there weren't that many African Americans in California. They were really worried about Chinese Americans voting. So there were something like fewer than 3,000 or 2 to 3,000 African Americans in the state. There were 50,000 Chinese and Chinese Americans in the state. And if the 14th Amendment gave them citizenship and the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote, they would definitely change the political calculus of the state. But it wasn't like these folks were pro-black rights either. After the rest of the country ratified the 14th and the 15th Amendments, California refused to do so. And in fact, federal registrars had to come out to Los Angeles and force the city to register African Americans to vote. The state of California did not ratify the 14th Amendment until the mid-20th century, in the 1950s, I believe, as a result of the rising civil rights movement. But it took them 60 years to do so, 70 years to do so, after the rest of the country did. All right, let's fast forward. I want to talk a little bit about women and their right to vote. This is the one place where California was actually on the cutting edge, but not in the way you might think. So California, first, there's a proposition on the ballot in 1896 in California to grant women the right to vote. That proposition goes down to defeat. It comes back onto the ballot in 1911. Interestingly enough, although we think of the cities in California as progressive today, almost every city in California, with the exception of Los Angeles, voted against women's suffrage in 1911. It was the rural areas of California that voted for it. And I would argue that that's in part because it's part of a larger theme about women's suffrage, in that the West gave women the right to vote before the East. Rural areas gave women the right to vote before cities, in part because frontier women were so vital to the success of their communities that they had more social power and thus ultimately more political power than women in the cities. And the last thing I want to talk about is in 2001, I know I'm jumping very quickly to past the civil rights movement, which is actually my area of expertise, but Kim did a nice job talking about the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s that are crucial. I want to go into 2001 because in 2001, California passed its own Voting Rights Act to strengthen the federal Voting Rights Act that had been passed in 1965. I don't think Californians realized that the Supreme Court would gut the Voting Rights Act as it did in the 2010s. But there was already some debate about the recertification of the law, the passage of the renewal of the law. And there was some sense that it didn't really work in California. And the reason it didn't work in California is because California jurisdictions used non-racial, supposedly race-neutral ways of keeping especially Latinx folks from voting and winning office. So one of the ways they did that, reduce the power of the right to vote, was at-large elections. So anytime you have a racial minority in an at-large elections, if a racial minority candidate is running for election and all whites don't vote for them, by definition, as a minority, they're not going to win in an at-large election. But if you allow district elections, geographical districts, then they can win. So the Voting Rights Act in California in 2001 made it easier for people to sue jurisdictions under these kind of quote-unquote race-neutral ways because they were having clearly racially discriminatory outcomes. I'll give you one example of that and then I'll stop. Most of these challenges were brought to cities in the Central Valley and Southern California. The one example is in Escondido, which is a town in San Diego County. In 2013, Escondido had 49% Mexican American or Latinx residents. But in the city's 125-year history, only 2 Mexican Americans had ever been elected to city council. So with the help of several legal organizations, folks challenged that, and Escondido went to a district-wide voting instead of at-large voting. Today, 3 of the 4 city council people are Latinx. So that's the power of the vote. That's the power of challenging even laws that look race neutral on the surface, have racially discriminatory effects, basically. And I'll stop there. So thank you.
Don't stop. That was just getting good. I appreciate you breaking it down the way you did and offering such great history. This has been a great history lesson for all my history fans out there. I'm sure you're enjoying this a lot. So thank you all so much. History is also currently being made right now. And I want to take a moment to talk to Dr. Morimoto about voter suppression. And I want to get Dr. Morimoto's thoughts on exactly what does voter suppression look like and how can we combat it? We've seen a lot of things in the news and a lot of talk, I think, has emerged about what it actually means. So please enlighten us.
Great, thanks, Tremaine, and thank you to all the students who are here. I know yet another Zoom must feel exhausting, so we're grateful that you're here. And it just turns out you have a lot of historians on this panel by trade, though we don't all teach in the history department. So what I'd like to do in my few minutes is to give you a brief history of voter suppression, then talk about what it looks like now and how we can push back against it. So one of the reasons you might think, well, who cares about voter suppression? Dr. Hester-Williams, Dr. Estes has said those laws passed, isn't it done with? No, it's not, because we just find new ways to suppress the vote underneath these auspices. So the 14th and 15th amendment have been mentioned, which the 15th prohibited racial discrimination. So what are you going to do to suppress the vote of these newly freed Black folks who you aren't sure are going to support the candidates you want supported? Well, you put in some barriers like poll taxes where you have to pay a tax, or a constitution test, a literacy test. But the problem with that is if you do that, you also disenfranchise poor whites. And that's certainly not what the folks in power wanted to do. So the alternative was to include a grandfather clause. And I'm simplifying a lot, but basically the grandfather clause was either your grandfather had to vote and you had to be a direct descendant of that to be able to have the vote. And that meant, of course, none of the Black voters could vote because most of their folks had been enslaved. So it's a really quick and easy way to make people ineligible to vote. So going to the definition of voter suppression, what do we mean by it? It's any attempt to stop eligible voters from voting. But I think the other key part, and that's what's happening now in current efforts, it's an attempt to keep people ineligible who would otherwise be eligible to vote. And that is in essence what some of these other tactics around the law get at. So I'm gonna leave history and jump right to the present. What does voter suppression look like now? I'm gonna pick two specific examples. One you may have heard of, the election, the gubernatorial election in Georgia of Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp. And so what are some of the ways you can suppress a vote without suppressing a vote, right? Without, using violence like they did in the old days. One is you can close polling places. So they closed 214 polling places. That meant, where are they going to take the polling places out of? Probably the neighborhoods that are the least served in other means. And so you do the same thing. Now they're not politically served. So you remove those polling places, you reduce voting hours, because once again, working people might not have all day to go stand in line for 6 hours like it ended up being in Georgia. And that's one way to kind of make sure people aren't coming to the polls and voting. The other more major way, though, is to purge the election rolls. And so by purging, we mean, on a regular basis, the government goes through and they try to get rid of dead people, people who are no longer eligible because of felony conviction in some states, or they're accidentally registered twice, and they try to go through those rolls. But what Georgia did is a very aggressive voter purge, and other states have followed, where somebody called it disenfranchisement by typo. saying that if your voter registration did not match exactly with the name that the government had on record for you, you were ineligible to vote. And it could be something like a missing middle initial, right? And so sometimes I use my middle initial and sometimes I don't. So in Georgia, I'm not quite sure how it would play out. But on top of that, so you have this one piece where we're being really close reading on things, on typos, on names, and things like that. But then a really confusing message was sent out, because if you were in waiting to find out if you were in fact eligible, you could vote in person at the polls, but you could not vote by mail. And so that confused a lot of people who would have otherwise voted as well. So there's just these different ways of layering things upon these voters who then are thinking like, how many hoops do I need to jump through to vote here, man? And so the really heinous part about it, of course, though, is that Brian Kemp, who was one of the candidates, was overseeing the whole election, even though he was one of the candidates. So I don't know how you're supposed to watch your own election for cheating, but that's how it was. And so in the end, it was probably to date, one of the most successful voter suppression movements that I'm aware of in recent history, through the purging of rolls, closing of polls, shortening of hours. And all those things really ended up driving down the vote of traditionally disenfranchised people. So the second specific example I'd like to look at is Florida, which is happening right now as we speak. In 2018, Florida voted for and passed Amendment 4, which reinstated the vote for those who had been convicted of a felony. And that's huge because in Florida, that's 1.6 million people, or 1 out of every 10 voters. And the presumption is that those voters will vote a certain way. Whether it's true or not, I can't say, that's not my expertise, but that's the expectation the politicians have. So this law passed, voted by the general population. Let's give these people their vote back. What do we do to keep them from voting now that they're enfranchised? Oh, I know, we're gonna do the old poll tax, but we're not gonna call it a poll tax. We're gonna say, nope, you can't vote until you pay any outstanding fines, costs, whatever, there's like 4 things. But we're also gonna make it totally impossible for you to find out if you owe any money, if you have any outstanding fines, costs, etc. So you don't know, as a recently enfranchised voter, do I have things that make me ineligible? And if you are ineligible because you have things that need to be paid off, then you make yourself ineligible by then applying to become a voter, right? So you have that poll tax. Then LeBron James did first on a small scale, he's gonna pay this poll tax for people. And then today, Mike Bloomberg said he was gonna pay this poll tax for all these newly enfranchised voters in Florida. Just before I came online here, there was a quick news blurb, so I can't just, certify it. They were saying the Florida legislature was talking about investigating Bloomberg for campaign finance violation because he's trying to pay that poll tax. I don't know if it would be him or the Democratic Party that would get the violation, but the idea is, here's somebody who's saying, look, here are people who should be eligible to vote. They've gotten the vote back by general population vote. We've imposed a poll tax. Other people are going to come in to pay it. And now we're going to investigate for fraud. That's chilling, right? And that means 1/10 of the Florida electorate is going to be ineligible to vote if they're able to push through with this investigation. So those are 2 examples of what voter suppression looks like now. So what can you do? I wish I had more exciting
Please tell us what we can do, Lauren.
But
we need the help.
So one, and these aren't exciting, sexy things, right? One is you can educate yourself, right? And who wants to do that? But no, seriously, it means knowing what your rights are and also having a plan for when you go to the polls, because who knows what it's going to look like. Already in West Virginia, There have been Trump supporters outside the polls that were not exactly interfering, but some said felt intimidating. There was another story yesterday. So have a plan. If you see people, just be ready for that to go through. If you know there's long lines, bring a stool, bring a snack, right? All those things play into it, because the hope is if we make it hard enough for people to vote, they're not going to do it. The other thing you can do is help other people get educated. So finding out what your rights are as a voter and then sharing it with other people who might not know, in your family, your grandparents, that sort of thing. If people need to still register and they're in a state where they can still register, though the deadline's coming up quickly, help them go through that process. So one of the things I'm doing is there's an organization where you can call people in states to help them order their absentee ballots, right? And since I don't like to talk to people unless that I don't know, unless I have a script, that's really good for me because there's a script. The last thing I'm doing is I'm also, don't want to show addresses, I'm writing letters. So they're form letters from an organization called Vote Forward, and there's a place to put a little personalized blurb. And some dude, forget his name, did a study about does the sending of a letter actually make a difference? And he did a test of 1,000 voters, and he found there was a 2% increase if the letters were sent close to the election. So I'm writing letters knowing that it's not it's not like a 10% difference, but 2% could matter in this setting. The other thing you can do is if you are willing to be a poll worker, the pay sucks. It's $175 for like a 14-hour day. But I would rather have students like you in that polling area, because I know you're going to know the law. You're not going to let people get intimidated, and you're going to be able to help folks who are confused or feeling intimidated by the process. And it's so important because they're short of poll workers. They have a lot of election watchers apparently, but not enough poll workers. So that's something very concrete you can do. And then last but not least, in terms of voter suppression, is that you can make sure that everybody in your immediate circle who's eligible to vote is registered. There's if you go to Better Know a Ballot, it's related to Stephen Colbert's Late Show. It's a really great resource, actually. It's done well, where state by state, it shows what you need to do to get an absentee ballot, what the rules are for when you vote, what ID you need. In California, by the way, you don't need any, but in other states, you need like 2. And if you have friends and family who are voting, you can direct them to those places to find out what they need to know so they can exercise their right to vote. Like I said, nothing particularly sexy and all of that, but you know, writing letters, if it gets 2%, I'm down with it. If it can turn out, we're writing to nonpartisan letters, writing to registered voters who don't always vote. So if any of those things feel like things you can do, you know, you can email me or Tremaine can pass it along and I can give the information. But like I said, Vote Forward is the site for the letters. And they also have the telephone campaign as well. So that is my word.
Yeah, and thank you for giving us some tangible examples of ways that we can help stop voter suppression. I think that a lot of us talk about it, but may not know exactly what to do. So thank you for that. Sarah Clegg, I think you might have something to add.
I did. I just wanted to add on to Lauren's exceptional presentation, just to say that down ballot voting matters, local elections matter. In some senses, they matter more than the sexy presidential election. Just as a couple of examples, Lauren mentioned Dr. Morimoto mentioned the Florida Attorney General is going to investigate the payment of this poll tax. Attorney generals are elected positions, and so I would think that voters in Florida and possibly voters in Kentucky today might want to think about their local elections. So those down ballot votes matter. Voting for your local Congress people matters, and in terms of combating gerrymandering. I personally want to see my elected officials commit to combating gerrymandering. So that's, I just wanted to add that. Every vote is a local vote. And so really just do your research on what the local issues are and who the local candidates are. That's it.
Thank you. And that's actually a perfect segue into our next and final question for the panel. I have Dr. Jones here, and I was curious to hear what he had to say about understanding ballot propositions and getting to know your local community representatives and why that's important for all of us as we move forward. I know that understanding the issues is something that he's really passionate about, and so I'm curious to hear.
Thank you, Tremaine. I also want to thank all the panelists. You know, every year when we get close to election, you hear a number of folks who talk about their vote doesn't matter, they're not going to vote, et cetera, et cetera. But I think you all did an outstanding job illustrating why it's so important to vote. Because if it wasn't, then there wouldn't be this collective effort to suppress votes, to put these artificial mechanisms in place to keep people from voting, especially people of color. And so as you look at the question, why is it important to understand the different ballot propositions and get to know your community representatives? Because these are the folks that this gives you an opportunity to shape where you are locally, right? If you're looking at the different people that are representing you locally, you have an opportunity to get to know them, to help inform their policy, the different things that they're representing. You also have an opportunity to really shape the local landscape. As Lauren had mentioned, that or Sarah rather, that a lot of times you are going to be directly impacted more so at the local level or the state level than you are at the national level, the different propositions that are out there. And so it's very important to understand that when you look at voter turnout, low turnout means that important local issues are determined by a limited group of voters that makes a simple vote can even be more statistically meaningful. So it's very important that there's three things that you can do, whether or not you are a registered voter or not. Everyone can participate in this. And I encourage you to really make sure that you're informed on what the issues are, right? Make sure that you're knowledgeable and get out and talk to different people, because you have an opportunity to voice your opinion, especially on social media, right? And then the third thing is that you can volunteer. Whether or not you are registered to vote or not, or you have the right to vote or not, you can still volunteer and help officials get elected on issues that are important to you. So never underestimate the power of your vote, of one vote, of the collective vote. And that's it for me.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. J. All right, so we have approached time. We are actually over time, and we have time for one question, and I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Gerald.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Jor from the Hub Cultural Center. And we have one question about the 1619 project. And I think this is directed at Dr. Excuse me. Okay, we have one question about the 1619 project and how it may attempt to address the whitewashing of our history, especially with regards with the right to vote. And that question is directed at Dr. Hester-Williams.
Thank you, Jor. Let me first of all say I'm the one with all the background noise. I think I have the window open and the blinds are just beating on making noise. So I apologize for that. The 1619 project, which came out through the New York Times around a year ago now, is very instrumental. I really don't feel that I have enough time to talk about how important, talk about the substance of the 1619 project, which was basically a news article that won the Pulitzer Prize, by the way, for journalism, in laying out the history. That's 1619, when the first 20 Africans came who would be the ancestors for future generations of enslaved people, and what I've already talked about. So I said it in the chat. I don't know if it will be available to everyone to see that. And as a matter of fact, I have a 1619 project meeting, believe it or not, in 15 and at 6:30 in 20 minutes or so. Because the meeting is about bringing the 1619 project to the Napa School District. That is happening all over the country. The 1619 project was not just an accounting of that history of American slavery, of US slavery, but it was also, it had a curriculum attached to it. They published a curriculum. And so many school districts have adopted the 1619 curriculum, and I'm on a Teach Truth California organization that's trying to do the same here in Napa County. So I won't take up too much time other than to say you should really understand that the fact that Donald Trump is bringing up critical race studies and specifically targeting the 1619 project and critical race studies is because of its power to transform not only our educational system and what the curriculum from K through 12, and already we have AB 1460, which is a requirement for ethnic studies at all of the CSU, that you would have to have an ethnic studies class to graduate from any CSU. So we are making so much progress, and that progress is constantly being pushed back on. And we should realize, I was in an Ethnic Studies Council meeting this morning, and I'm going to leave you with this thought from one of the people on the steering committee, who said, we should always be concerned when we're in struggle. When we are in struggle, we should always be vigilant. We should know that we see that this long and deep history of anti-racism, of racial injustice, of structural racism, that we see that it persists, and that it, as Lauren says, it morphs, it changes. We push back, for our rights, we advocate for our rights, and we win, and we have victories like the 1619 project, like the CSU, the AB 1460 ethnic studies legislation. And then what do we get? We get politicians who use very nefarious, subversive ways to push against that. We talked about the poll taxes. There's just so many ways in which we have to be aware that the struggle continues, and that we can't let up. We have to keep going, and we have to be vigilant. And I want to thank Lauren especially for letting us know how important that is, and Sarah, and you know, it's really something. We have a lot of work to do, but we've also done a lot of good work. And thank you, Steve, because there were a lot of things about the California history that I have to say I didn't know. So, and Dr. J, yeah, there are things we can do, and there are things we must do. And the 1619 project supporting that is one of them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hester-Williams. I want to say a final thank you to all of our panelists for being here tonight and giving us their time and their expertise. My cup is full. I feel very excited to go vote. I hope everybody that was listening and that watches this webinar feels the same way. Have a great evening and continue to be informed. And if you have any questions that come to you later, feel free to email diversity@sonoma.edu, and I'll be sure to get your question to the panelists. Good night, everyone.
Night. Thank you.
Hey, wonderful job hosting.
Yes, great job.
Thanks, Tremaine.
Thank you.